Jonathan, Dave, and Phil, thanks for stopping by. I actually just showed up, I guess virtually, at Barcamp a couple minutes ago. So my son had a tennis tournament this morning that I was attending, but glad I can at least get here for part of it. And I thought it'd be fun to contribute again, since it feels like part of my normal yearly calendar to go to Barcamp and do a talk. It felt like something was missing, so I'm glad Dave and the crew made this happen. So I don't know how many of you know already something about .NET and .NET Core and the state of things in the Microsoft stack right now, but I know there's a lot of us who are kind of focused in on the stack that we're working on every day. You might not get a chance to see what's going on in some of the other stacks. So I thought it'd be kind of fun to just do a super quick, super low res version of what's going on in .NET. And yes, in fact, .NET does run on Linux now. So let's talk about that. Just a quick overview. Normally I do hour-long talks, and there's probably 4 to 10 points in here, but we're doing a really short one here today because I also want to do a demo for you at the end. I'm just going to kind of talk about why .NET and .NET Core specifically I think is a great option to look at again right now if you're interested in looking at other stacks from what you're familiar with. So the first topic I want to talk about before I get to the demo is just that .NET platform and languages are very well loved and are really increasing in love. So many of us have probably had some experience with TypeScript in recent years. TypeScript was actually invented, I guess you could say, by the same guy who invented C#. So a lot of the stuff you're maybe familiar with from TypeScript, maybe got familiar with in TypeScript for the first time. Things like generic types, for example, are things that actually were originally inspired by the C# language. But in Stack Overflow's annual survey, this year C# is for languages was number 8 most loved, and you can see it was in kind of a tight pack with everything there in the TypeScript to like Swift to JavaScript category there. Rust is definitely leading the pack with the love. When it comes to web frameworks, actually ASP.NET Core, which is the .NET Core version, and if you're not familiar with the term .NET Core already, let me give you a little background on that. .NET Core just basically means the new, rewritten from the ground up in the last several years version of .NET that is totally feature compatible with the .NET that's been around for about 15 years or so, but is now rewritten for modern web and application development, written to be much faster, written for the cloud, written for all the things that exist today that didn't exist in 2000 when it first came out. And because it's also rewritten, the original dream of .NET was to be cross-platform the way Java was back then, and that dream is finally realized with .NET Core. It runs equally well on Mac OS, Linux, and Windows, as well as containers and things like that. So anyway, ASP.NET Core is just the web development framework, server-side web development framework from .NET Core. And that actually won the #1 spot for the most loved web framework this year. Another great reason is if you're looking for developers, there's a pretty large community. So obviously when you look at things like the front-end web technologies, you see a lot of people in those these days, myself included. But just shortly after that, you see that the C# community is a pretty large one as well. So lots of developers, lots of support, lots of other people who are using it and developing libraries for it and all that kind of stuff that you want when you're picking a framework or a language. And then actually, I don't know how to count this exactly, but either 4th or 6th place for the most used for web frameworks are ASP.NET and the core version of it. I suppose if you combine those together, it would be dominant, but separated like this, it's still pretty big, each of them. So again, very large community. And then the last reason to use it, and this is something that wasn't necessarily always true for .NET in the sort of 2000s, early 2000s era, and that is that it's very fast. If you're familiar with the Tech and Power benchmark, it's actually a set of benchmarks, but ASP.NET Core specifically, because this is a web benchmark. ASP.NET Core actually performs quite well in this regularly. You can see here in the plain text test that ASP.NET Core is in the first and third positions, and is competing with some other things like Rust and Go in there. And then if you look at the composite scores, you get things like Rust and Go, of course, showing up towards the top, but even just number 6 in this overall composite score for all the different tech and power tests is ASP.NET Core. So pretty impressive for a framework that's been around for as many years as .NET has, that this new rewritten from the ground up version of it in the last few years can be a contender for the top, easily in the top 10 most performant web frameworks. And then the last reason, and this is really, I think, one of the coolest, because I know I'm on my Windows machine right now, but I have a Mac. I know there's teams that have people who are on Macs and Windows, and maybe that odd guy who has a laptop that he installed Linux on, and you want to be able to have all those people contribute to the team equally well. I own a company called Trailhead Technology Partners. We do custom development, and my team is on all of those different platforms, and it really doesn't even matter like it used to. It doesn't matter which one they're on. They can work equally as well on anything, including the backend .NET code. And that story applies equally as well to both the development time. So as you're developing, you could be using things like Visual Studio for Mac, Visual Studio obviously for Windows, VS Code. There's lots of great tooling like that. There's also a CLI, command line interface for .NET that works on all those different platforms. But then it also applies to the deployment or runtime environment as well. So if you want to host .NET in a container, if you want to host it in the cloud, if you want to host it on Linux behind Nginx, or if you want to host it with Apache web server, or obviously on Windows as well, all of that stuff is equally as easy to do with .NET. So now with all of that out of the way, let me show you guys real quick a demo. So I toyed with the idea of setting up a VM to do this in the cloud, but if you're not familiar with it, there's something on Windows now called the Windows Subsystem for Linux. It's not an emulator, but it's actually the best way to describe it is like an interpretation layer between Windows and Linux. So I'm running a full-blown Ubuntu instance here and at the bash shell. So I've done a couple of things ahead of time just to save some sort of boring time of installing things.
I couldn't hear what you said.
My watch wanted to get involved there. So I just went to the, if you go to, I think it is .net, like that, yep. On any platform, it's going to take you to a page that tells you how to get started downloading it. I've already gone to the page that tells you about installing it on Ubuntu, and I've scrolled down to the instance I'm running, which is 18, or the version, I'm sorry, which is 18.04. And there's one prerequisite you have to install first. So basically, even if you're not super familiar with bash, you can just copy this command and run that, and then you can copy this set of commands and run those, and that's going to install both prerequisites. And in this case, the .NET SDK, or Software Developers Kit, lets you develop for .NET on Ubuntu. If you just want the runtime, maybe that you're setting this up on a server or something, you can instead install the runtime environment, which the command for that is down here. So I've done that ahead of time. If I just type .NET here at the command line, you can see that the .NET command line is already installed, and that is along with the runtime is basically what those commands installed. I've got version 3.1, which is the currently newest supported version of .NET Core. And I've also created a folder which I've just called ASP.NET Core. If I do a listing of it, you can see here there's nothing in there at this point. So I'm just going to tell the .NET command line that I want to create a new MVC project. If you're not familiar with .NET, you may have heard of at least MVC, the acronym in general. It's the Model View Controller Design Pattern. It's also the name of a framework that's built on top of ASP.NET that lets you develop MVC style applications using ASP.NET Core in this case. So you can see that that has basically created a new project for me in this local directory. And also you see it says it did a restore. If you're sort of new to .NET, .NET has a package manager like a lot of frameworks do. The .NET one is called NuGet, and that restore complete is basically telling me that all of the NuGet packages for this project have been restored as well. So now if I do a listing, we can see all the stuff that got created in this project, including some folders with some other code in them. And this is just a standard looking .NET or .NET Core application. But if I go into like the views folder here and do a listing, you can see there's an index. If I view that in VI, you can see that it's just some HTML plus some markup. This is called Razor syntax in .NET. And I'll exit out of VI. And I'll go up a couple directories here. Oops, wrong slash. Go up a couple directories here. Now I'm going to use the .NET commands to, I could do .NET build if I just wanted to build it, but I'm going to actually do .NET run to run the debugger. And because it actually hasn't built the project since the latest changes, it's going to do that first and then run it. And you can see here that it's created a development server for me. So I'm going to flip over to my browser and just go to localhost. And you can see I'm now running a ASP.NET Core application in Linux and testing it on my Chrome for Windows. So that's kind of cool, right? Now, if you're the kind of person who's dubious of demos, I'm with you. So let's go back into that views folder, and I'm going to edit the index here. I'll just make a simple change. Change that, and I guess to make it more obvious, we'll also change this as well. And we'll write that and then go back up and do a .NET run again. Now, obviously, you don't have to use VI, but just for simplicity, that's what I picked. I'll go back here and run this application again, and you can see both the title of the page and this header have changed. So we are, in fact, running .NET code on this Linux environment inside of Windows. So that's kind of all I had planned. But I will open it up to questions if anybody had anything they wanted to chat about on the topic.
I couldn't.
And my watch got involved again. So any thoughts about any of that? Anybody seeing that for the first time? I got one no.
I've heard about it, haven't seen it firsthand or found an excuse to play with it yet.
Yeah.
It's not really the .NET part, but the Windows subsystem for Linux seems very cool and compelling.
Yeah, that is really cool, especially if you're used to using anything in Bash for any developer tools or anything like that. If that's your preference, but let's be honest, Windows is kind of the easier thing to use. A lot of times, it can be you can kind of have the best of both worlds, and it's not like some sort of weird emulator where only 50% of things are going to work or whatever. It really works. In fact, I actually have I've goofed around with it before where I've been able to set up a display and export my display to a fake display back to Windows and run UI applications like a Linux browser and actually run that where I can see it exported onto my Windows display as if it was running in Windows. So that's pretty amazing. I've also run GIMP before, like everyone knows GIMP, the image editor that you can run on X Windows and stuff like that, and been able to run that on my Windows machine. So it's really quite compatible. Anybody have any questions or comments or feedback, thoughts?
I know you're fairly involved in the .NET community. Have you found people taking advantage of the cross-platform compatibility, or is it still mostly used for Windows applications?
Yeah, I think like any platform, you'll find people who are, behind the curve, who are maybe even not aware. They're maybe .NET developers, but they're maybe not even aware of any of this stuff yet. Occasionally I'll speak at conferences, and some people who have been developing in .NET for 10, 15 years, this will all be news to them. But I've also seen lots of companies and teams that are, using containers, and they were super excited about these changes and able to jump their whole team over to use .NET Core really fast so that they could start doing containers. Or maybe there's a company actually I worked with who was running some add-on software that was their product, that was an add-on to a I forget what the name, it was like one of Cisco's operating systems for their switches or something, which under the covers is Linux. They wanted to be able to add on a web application, a web interface to it. They felt like their options for development were limited because it was Linux and they could only do things that would run on Linux. And now they're running, .NET application on a Cisco router because you can. So stuff like that for sure has been opened up.
I just started a side project using .NET Core, and actually have found, I don't know if you've ever used Rider, which is a Linux-based IDE, or well, it's cross-platform IDE for .NET Core and ASP.NET. Pretty cool. I just started it and just started using it, and really find it pretty nice.
Yeah, I've heard good things about Rider. I've played around with it, but I've never really used it for a production application. But I know people who do and swear by it. I think it's Electron based, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's the same folks make ReSharper, which has been an add-on for a long time for the .NET community. So.
Yep, and they make a bunch of IDEs for other platforms, for Python and for Perl and iOS and stuff like that. Yep, they do a good job. Cool. Well, I hope everybody got to see something new that they hadn't seen before, something interesting that you can play around with. If nothing else, you can install a Windows subsystem for Linux tonight, right? Cool. Well, I'll be hanging out on the chat for a little bit, so if anybody wants to chat about anything, let me know. But thanks for stopping in, everybody.
Someone had a
Thank you.
check out about.
Oh, sorry, I haven't figured out the chat in here yet. What was it?
Yeah, you got it.
An organization has piles of old VB.NET code lying around. Is VB.NET still supported on Linux, or is it just C#? VB.NET is, but just be aware that some of the frameworks, like web forms, for example, which was the original .NET web development stack, have not and probably never will be ported over to .NET Core. So depending on what the code is using, it may be totally portable, but VB.NET is supported as well as C# for almost everything in .NET Core. Good question. Is that the one you were seeing, Dave?
Yep.
Okay, cool. All right, well, thanks everybody. Appreciate you stopping in. I'll talk to you all later and hopefully see you in person next year. Take care.